This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Regular commentator Fred Rotondaro says Mario Cuomo was a legend, and you might be surprised at who he thinks is a worthy successor to him as a no-apologies progressive. With controversy bubbling about the portrayal of LBJ in the movie Selma, civil rights historian David Chappell offers a nuanced view of both the president and Martin Luther King. And Bill Press talks 2016 politics with Burgess Everett of Politico. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Regular commentator Fred Rotondaro memorialized Mario Cuomo as a giant, a legend, and says the closest person we have to him, a no-apologies progressive, is Elizabeth Warren. And we say hello to regular commentator Fred Rotondaro, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and contributor to the Huffington Post, also active in the lay Catholic community, and Fred has also served as executive director of the National Italian American Foundation. Fred Rotondaro, thanks very much for joining us, as always, on americasdemocrats.org.
Jim, as always, it's a delight to be here and talking to you.
And nice to have you with us as well. We wanted to get your thoughts, Fred, about Mario Cuomo, whose death recently reminded us of what a real progressive national leader looked like. Can there ever again be a thoughtful, self-reflective leader like he was?
Oh, I think there can be, but I don't look for him or her in the next year or two. Cuomo was really a legend. He was a giant. One of his constant themes was we stand on the shoulders of giants, by which he meant we stand on the shoulders of those strong immigrant men and women who came to America and who did so much. And you can certainly apply that line to him. When you're talking about Mario Cuomo, when you are remembering him, you are looking at someone who was indeed a giant, no question.
Mm-hmm. What about somebody like an Elizabeth Warren? Certainly very progressive.
Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren might be, very simply, the closest thing we have today to Mario Cuomo. Mm-hmm. I think the key to Mario Cuomo was that he was a progressive. He was a no-apologies progressive. And I think, very importantly, he looked to the federal government not as, well, we have to be ashamed of the government, or they do this wrong, or they do that wrong, but rather he looked at the federal government as serving the interest of the middle class and the poor, protecting the average person from the predators that are all around us. And I think if you were to say, who's that one person in Democratic or Republican politics today who most resembles that philosophy, I'd say it's probably Elizabeth Warren.
Mm-hmm. You know, in all the obituaries that I've read over the last while since his death for Mario Cuomo, his 1984 Democratic Convention speech was mentioned as the high point of his oratory. But he, in fact, told you it was not. What did he think his best speech was?
Well, the 1984 speech was absolutely incredible. I mean, it was just a traditionally sound, perfectly organized speech. But in 1990, Mario Cuomo spoke at the National Italian American Foundation. He followed a series of stars, including Alan Alda, who was absolutely brilliant. Mario got up to speak on a Saturday night. It was getting close to midnight, and he did this Italian shtick. He grabbed the waiter's cloth and started pretending that he was removing plates from the table, sort of a let's get on with this show kind of thing. He then started talking, and very quickly he moved into his parents and their lives as immigrants and how they had been, in a way, abused, how they had been treated cruelly. And then, very quickly, he moved to the political topic of the day, the Cuban refugees who were coming to the United States. And they were being opposed by a number of people. In Florida, a leader of the group trying to stop the refugees from landing in Florida, from taking up root in Florida, was the grandson of Italian immigrants. And Mario Cuomo, and a lot of this was off the top of his head. He had been taking notes. I was seated right behind him. I could see very clearly. A lot of this was, as I say, off the top of his head. He started talking about those refugees. Now, they're us. They're we Italians 100 years ago. He made the human connection of his parents who had been insulted, of his father. He talked about his father, as he often did, of his father having blisters and blood, and literally bloody feet from the work he was doing, and he made the connection of those immigrants with the Cuban refugees. We had, as usual, a well-heeled crowd, a lot of people from the labor movement, tremendous number of people from Wall Street. They rose as one person when Mario Cuomo ended because they saw the humanity of what he was saying. And I think he was I know he was just extraordinarily proud of that speech, as he should have been.
Mm-hmm. That one probably runs a lot more deeply than the 1984 convention speech.
I think it does.
Yeah, and
I think.
In that regard, what do you think about President Obama's move to restore relations with Cuba?
I like it. I think as most people would say, we tried 50 years the other way. It hasn't worked. We're probably doing very little more than helping the regime. We're certainly hurting the people. And both members of the ruling regime, both of the Castro brothers, are now in their 80s. They're not going to be there very much longer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this move by President Obama may hasten their departure, but at the very least, it's going to set the stage for who replaces them. And it just seems to make so much more sense than continuing to do what we've been doing.
Absolutely. Now, I heard that you once introduced Mario Cuomo to Antonin Scalia over lunch. What was that lunch like?
That was fun, I'll tell you. We had, as you know, Jim, and as regular listeners could guess, I'm sort of a progressive. The president of my board was a guy named Ken Charnley, wonderful guy, deeply conservative, but a thinking, rational conservative. He called one day Matilda Cuomo, who was on our board. Mario answered. Next thing we knew, I'm getting a phone call from Ken saying, you know, Mario Cuomo has never met Antonin Scalia. And I said, well, we got to fix that up. And we did. It took us a while because obviously both very, very busy guys. But it took us a while. Ken, myself, Justice Scalia, Mario Cuomo met for a quiet lunch, had a wonderful couple of hours, good Italian food, a place called Galileo, which no longer is in business, some wonderful Italian wine, and two deeply brilliant men, both of them very, very serious Catholics. Very serious Catholics. And they started from there. They started talking about their Catholicism. They talked about affirmative action. The lunch started with Governor Cuomo saying, Mr. Justice, and with Justice Scalia saying, Governor Cuomo. It ended on a Nino and Mario note. I think the two of them just very, very much enjoyed the conversation with each other and exploring their own political philosophies, which both had thought through very, very deeply.
I would.
Cuomo, was offered a spot on the Supreme Court, and for whatever reason, he did not take it. I would have loved, as I think the rest of the country would have loved to have seen Mario Cuomo and Antonin Scalia debating each other over the next 20 years.
Gosh,
that would have been a real intellectual feast.
I would love to have been a fly on the wall for that lunch.
Oh, that's what I was. I was sitting there, and I would say profound things like, either of you guys want some more wine. Other than that, we were just, Ken and I were throwing questions out and having a wonderful time. It really was.
Could you pass the bread?
That's pretty much it, yeah.
Now, this may be unfair to ask, I don't know, but what's your assessment of Mario Cuomo's son, Andrew, governor of New York?
Well, yes, it is, Jim. It is unfair to ask. No, it's not. I'm just kidding. I think he's been a very, very good governor. I think he'll be a better governor. I think he wants to be president. I don't think that's saying anything unique. But, in a crazy way, Andrew Cuomo, and I hope Matilda doesn't hear this, but Andrew Cuomo I consider more the political son of someone like Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was a centrist Democrat. That's where Andrew Cuomo was coming from. As I mentioned before, Mario Cuomo was a totally unapologetic liberal. This is where I'm coming from. Like it, don't like it, this is what I am. That's not his son, Andrew Cuomo, nor is that anyone, I think, on the Democratic scene right now, except, as I say, with the possibility of Elizabeth Warren. So do I admire Andrew Cuomo? Absolutely. I heard him give a speech years ago when he was Secretary of HUD. Remember, he was Bill Clinton's HUD guy. Mm-hmm. And Andrew Cuomo talked about poverty, and I said he's got a lot of his dad's DNA in him.
Hmm. It's interesting because so many people, back when Bill Clinton first ran for president, they wanted Mario Cuomo, especially the far to the left. They wanted Mario Cuomo, and Clinton's whole idea was, no, we got to bring it more to the center. And it's interesting that Andrew, you kind of get the sense he actually wants to run for president, where his dad didn't.
No, his father, as I say, could have been Supreme Court justice just by saying yes. But he never really had that fire in the belly, and I guess that's the big thing. He was a very, very typical Italian male. Didn't want to leave home too often. Liked to sleep in his own bed. Just happened to have an IQ probably 50 or 60 points above most human beings, and had maybe the greatest gift for rhetoric of any politician, I was going to say in the generation, possibly of any politician in the last century. But he just didn't have that fire in the belly that made him say, I'm willing to wake up 40 mornings in a row in Iowa or in South Dakota or in South Carolina. Just didn't want to go through that. Mm-hmm. And he didn't have the ego that some politicians have that basically says, I'm the guy that can do this, and nobody else can do it. I don't think Cuomo ever had that feeling or that philosophy.
Okay. Fred Rotondaro, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, regular contributor to our program, americasdemocrats.org, and, of course, the Huffington Post, and has served as Executive Director of the National Italian American Foundation. Fred, as always, a pleasure having you with us today on americasdemocrats.org. Looking forward to doing it again soon.
Jim, thank you. I do, too.
Thanks very much. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Historian David Chappell, in the wake of controversy over the movie Selma, says there was considerable friction between President Johnson and Martin Luther King, but no different than friction that often arises among partners. We'll hear from him on that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you need a good, doable New Year's resolution, try this. I resolved to do my part this year to stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The what? Most people never heard of the TPP. But everyone who cares about good American jobs, an unpolluted environment, food safety, and other fundamentals, especially including our basic right to be a sovereign, self-governing people, should take a peek at this big nasty of a global trade scam. You'd find that the so-called 12-nation partnership actually has little to do with trade and everything to do with enthroning a plutocracy of global corporations over us. Representative Keith Ellison has warned that TPP is, quote, the largest corporate power grab you never heard of. One reason we commoners don't know about it is that the corporate and governmental elites of the 12 nations have been negotiating this momentous deal in strict secrecy, not only keeping us in the dark, but also Congress. Another reason, however, is that the mass media has been shockingly silent, apparently even incurious, about what clearly is a huge story with historic consequences. FAIR, the excellent watchdog group that tracks media coverage, found that ABC, CBS, CNN, Fox, and NBC have offered the American public practically zero news stories about TPP. Even though the looming power grab has now spawned protests around the world, generated a major coalition of some 500 grassroots groups in our country loudly opposing the rip-off deal, and has produced an odd bedfellow, rare bipartisan alignment of opponents in Congress, there's been a TV blackout. Could it possibly be that the global conglomerates that own our so-called news networks don't want us knowing what's up behind TPP's closed doors? Surely not. This is Jim Hightower saying, to learn what the corporate powers are up to, go to stopthetpp.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor. All for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. What was the relationship between Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King? Historian David Chappell said there was friction, that both alienated a lot of people, but that they did work together to get the landmark Voting Rights Act passed. And we say hello to University of Oklahoma history professor David Chappell, who is a scholar of the American civil rights struggle. He's the author of a new book, Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King. Professor David Chappell, thanks for joining us again on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here.
And nice to have you back with us. You know, there's been a lot of talk about this movie, Selma, depicting Dr. Martin Luther King and the relationship between Dr. King and LBJ. And a lot of folks, especially in the LBJ family, have been saying, gosh, it's not fair. He wasn't as bad as the movie depicts him. The president wasn't. You know a lot about that relationship between the two of them. How well did they get along? How much friction was there?
Well, there certainly was considerable friction, and I think there's friction between Dr. King and a lot of people that he's allied with and that are, partners in some of his projects. Lyndon Johnson was a difficult ally and a difficult adversary. I have not seen the movie yet. It doesn't open here until tomorrow, so I'd reserve some judgment on that. But on the general topic, of course, it came into the headlines earlier during the 2008 presidential campaign when Hillary Clinton was perhaps overly praising Lyndon Johnson at the expense of King and others who were, working in the streets and risking their lives, putting pressure on the administration. I think it's fair to say that Lyndon Johnson did bring tremendous vigor and commitment to the campaign for civil rights once he got into the White House. I think he's an ambiguous figure before then, but I would direct readers to my earlier book, my first book, which was published in 1994, called Inside Agitators, White Southerners and the Civil Rights Movement. It has a couple of chapters on, Johnson's history, both in the Senate in the 1950s and then as Senate Majority Leader, and then as vice president and president. I would also direct readers, listeners, to Ralph Ellison's essay. Ralph Ellison, the famous African-American author of Invisible Man and other classic essays on African-American history and culture and whatnot. He wrote a wonderful eulogy to Lyndon Johnson called The Myth of the Flawed White Southerner, in which he takes to task Northern liberals, black and white, for their underestimation and really condescension toward Johnson because he had that Southern corn-pone accent and manner. They assumed that he was just a typical Southern bigot. And I think Ellison is quite eloquent and penetrating in his understanding of Johnson's journey and where Johnson led the American South and the Democratic Party. And I think he would make a nice counterbalance to the if people are underestimating Lyndon Johnson's role in the climactic years of the Civil Rights Movement. I think Ellison makes a great counterpoint there and argues that Johnson was, whatever liberals may have said about him and however he may have alienated them, he would go down in history as one of the greatest presidents ever in the eyes of African Americans and poor people.
Was the campaign in Selma, in fact, the high water of the civil rights movement? It did result in what many people say was the greatest piece of civil rights legislation since the 15th Amendment. The
Voting Rights Act of 1965. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that is in many ways the high water mark of the civil rights movement. King's relationship with Johnson went rapidly downhill shortly after that act, when they were agreed on endorsing the next step in the legislative program of the civil rights movement, and that is what finally became, after King's assassination, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, which in many ways was the most radical of the Civil Rights Acts. They were agreed on that item at the top of their domestic agenda, but prospects for passage of that law were increasingly dismal up until the time of King's assassination. And in the last year of King's life, King went over to active and really militant opposition to the American position in the Vietnam War, and that really burned Johnson's bacon, and they were, deeply alienated from one another. But it's fair to say that King was alienated from a lot of other important liberal leaders, again, black and white, not just over his position on the Vietnam War, militantly opposed to the Vietnam War, but his insistence on turning up the heat of the protests. Many people in the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization that King founded, thought that he was ill-advised and didn't have his strategic priorities in endorsing in pushing for the Poor People's Campaign to begin it was scheduled to begin in April 1968. Mm-hmm. That really bothered even some of King's closest allies and supporters, as well as the more moderate liberals at the NAACP and in the Democratic Party and various liberal organizations, which had previously supported many parts of King's civil rights agenda, but not quite the radical strategies and in some cases goals that King endorsed.
Yeah. Given the state, congressional, and Supreme Court attacks on voting rights, could one argue that the civil rights movement has come to an end?
Well, I don't think one could argue it has come to an end. There are still people struggling out there. The successes have certainly dwindled, although one of the things I argue in my book is that after King's death, there was a tremendous amount of activity, highly organized, ambitious activity to change the course of history through national legislation and through other means, organizing the African American electorate newly enfranchised by that Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of '65. The new population of new class of black elected officials were perhaps in need of organization and an agenda, and I write a chapter about that and the effort to achieve full employment legislation, which Coretta King, Martin Luther King's widow, carried the torch for and did a lot of organizing for. There was a tremendous amount of activity after the Civil Rights Movement receded from the headlines, and that 1968 Act, the Fair Housing Act, could also be seen as the high water mark of the Civil Rights Movement. It hasn't been recognized as the important piece of legislation that it was, and I make a case in the book that it really was extremely important, arguably the most radical of the three great Civil Rights Acts that were enacted in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. People are still active today, people coming out in huge numbers to demonstrate over police brutality, police violence in places like Ferguson and New York City. That's very much in the headlines now. I think people are very conscious of being part of a historic movement that not only goes back to Martin Luther King in the 1950s and 60s and all of his allies and predecessors in that movement, but back to the movement during the first Reconstruction and even before with the abolitionists and other formations of African American protest. Historians have traced those back somewhat spottily, haltingly to struggles with the Middle Passage, that is, resistance to the slave trading between Africa and the New World.
You brought up Ferguson and the other mm-hmm. movements that are going on. Are these protests that are continuing over the police treatment of young African Americans? Do you look at that as a positive outgrowth of the Civil Rights Movement or an unfortunate development in the way that they've occurred?
Well, I think the police violence that we are seeing is certainly an unfortunate development. Mm-hmm. Police brutality was certainly on the agenda of many activists in the 1960s, both in the South and in the big metropolitan areas of the North and West. It's an issue that's much more prominent today than it has been at various times in the past. But remember Rodney King and the L.A. riot. That issue was again very prominent in the early 1990s. I think it's a perennial issue that comes to the fore again and again. It has proven, I think, one of the most intractable and difficult parts of the unfinished agenda of the Civil Rights Movement from King's day. I think that people are protesting and actively concerned about some terribly tragic events is, first of all, inevitable. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's certainly of a piece with the protests that we can trace back to King's Day in the 1950s and 60s. I think people are right to feel that they are part of a historic movement that reaches back to King's Day and mm-hmm. and further back.
We're speaking with University of Oklahoma history professor David Chappell. He's the author of a new book, Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King. David, the King family has not always been generous granting permission for the use of some of his speeches. And aside from the question of public domain, do you think their stance protected or damaged Dr. King's reputation? And what would you say is Dr. King's reputation in the nearly 47 years after his death?
First of all, I made a point of not writing about the King family. I think, many people, when I was writing about the legacy of Martin Luther King, people would ask me about Coretta King, and she does appear quite often in the book, and about his children. And it seems to me that they deserve for their private lives and random quotations in the press a certain amount of privacy and I think a certain amount of historical perspective that I don't see what when the family appears in the press. It doesn't strike me as the most historically significant developments in the unfolding of the King legacy broadly conceived, where King is the symbol of a vast historic movement that had millions in its ranks. I wrote about what I saw as far more historically significant episodes and developments that involved Coretta King very often, but when they involved her, they involved planned and deliberate public appearances and statements, not what seemed to me, scattered and not so well organized appearances in the press. I don't really write about the King family in the sense that they are like a royal family.
Yeah.
I don't. That's just not what I'm attempting to do. I'm attempting to write about the public political movement that aimed for radical, history-changing legislation and changes in the political and economic structure of the country. But more generally, has King's legacy been a positive one? What was the rest of that question?
What would you say is Dr. King's reputation? In the 47 years after his death.
Well, I think it's remarkably positive. I think that people whose political opinions and positions today seem to be very much at odds with the stances that King took, notably on things like affirmative action, which King, of course, supported, though some people who carelessly quote him have the impression or wish to convey the impression that King's belief in colorblindness somehow would have led him to oppose affirmative action policies. That's just on its face false. And I think that actually, fortunately, those efforts to construe King as an opponent of affirmative action, I think that political conservatives have generally dropped that attempt. It was very popular during the Reagan years, but I think it's fallen out of usage since then. I think that generally people hold King up as a great moral hero and a great national leader. People respectfully pay their respects on his birthday celebrations that come around every year. You still do get occasional flashes of open opposition, but generally people seem to honor him, and I think that's a remarkable development, both given the things that have been discovered about his own marital indiscretions and his academic dishonesty, which I touch on those episodes, the public discussions of the discovery of his plagiarism when he was a student, and the public discussion of the evidence of his extramarital affairs. Despite all that, King has remained a remarkably resilient moral hero. I think a much more popular one, a much more unanimously honored and respected leader than he was in his own day, when he was reviled and hated and feared by huge portions of the population and by prominent elected officials, and perhaps most notoriously and powerfully the the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation during his entire lifetime, J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, okay. University of Oklahoma history professor David Chappell joining us today. He's the author of the new book, Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King. Professor David Chappell, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you very much.
All right, we'll talk to you soon. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Politico's Burgess Everett.
Burgess, it's good to see you. We've seen they're sworn in now. They're back. Right. The new Congress 2050. There was a big effort to topple John Boehner. How'd that work out?
It didn't work out so well for the rebels against the establishment. 25 people voted not for Boehner. Well, one
but
person.
Isn't that a record number of people to...
So I was talking about this in the Capitol, and some people were saying, were writing that, this was the biggest insurgency since the Civil War or something like that. Well, that's not really true, considering Newt Gingrich was toppled less than 20 years ago. So it wasn't the same, procedural voting him down on the on the House floor. But I mean, that was a much bigger deal than this was this week.
Sure. Yeah. And these are Tea Party members, basically, right? Who just who think Obama, who thinks Boehner's too close to Obama.
Yeah, they're worried. They really want him to oppose the president, take a hard line on literally everything, which is not how you're going to keep the government funded. Even the bare minimum it would be impossible to do that. And they're very incensed about that spending bill in December, which did not attack the immigration executive order shielding millions of people from deportation.
So can they vote against the speaker with impunity?
So two people, one who ran for speaker against Boehner, Daniel Webster, were kicked off the Rules Committee, but there's some talk about adding the other person, Rich Nugent, back on. So it's Boehner's definitely weighing this right now, but it seems right now that he's leaning towards not punishing them too hard. It's just not really his style.
Yeah. Well, in fact, he's been called. Several people have called him different adjectives to describe him because he has not been willing to stand up to the Tea Party. Here is the speaker yesterday, referencing that.
It does pain me to be described as spineless or a squish. And I tell you what pains me the most is when they describe me as the establishment.
And before that, he described himself as the most anti-establishment speaker in the history of the House, and he pointed to how he led the charge to get rid of earmarks.
Right.
So, which is not in dispute. You could certainly make an argument that maybe he's more establishment than another speaker, but the earmark thing it's a good. I mean, this was a regular order involved earmarks 10 years ago, and they're completely off the board at this point.
Right. No, he does get credit for that. At the same time, if John Boehner is not an establishment politician, is not part of the Republican establishment, I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
Right.
I'm just saying
the speaker, by definition, is the establishment, right?
And so is Mitch McConnell, and so is Jeb Bush. I mean, Ted Cruz isn't, I would say, right?
Well, he says he's not, but at some point, everybody's the establishment the longer you're in Republican politics, right? It's a very... I try to avoid using that term when I describe people in the Republican Party because many people take it as an insult, and it's just such a broad brush, It's like calling someone a hipster almost.
Yeah. So I want to discuss something with you. I was on an interview, a show being interviewed the other day about this, and the guy started out by saying, "Boy, you got to be depressed these days. Congress is back in town, and the Republicans control both houses. I mean, you must." And I said, "No, I'm not really that depressed, and I'll tell you why. I believe the ingredients are there. Look, I'd rather Democrats control both houses, fine, but I think the ingredients are there to get some things done this year. Mm-hmm. So I just want to lay this out quickly and see if you think I'm totally crazy. Mitch McConnell, like his politics or not, is a consummate wheeler dealer. So is John Boehner, if you let John Boehner be John Boehner.
Right.
And so is Barack Obama. And I think both sides want to know they've got to get some things done in the next 2 years. They can't go into 2016, Democrats, and blame everything on Republican obstructionism, and Republicans blame everything on Obama, you know.
Right.
So I think the potential, the ingredients are in place if they're willing to make it work.
I think you're correct, but I think they're definitely going to have to choose their spots, and there's a limited amount of time, in my opinion. By the fall of this year, everybody's going to be concentrating on the presidential race. Yesterday, it became apparent that the Iowa straw poll is going to happen in August, which draws so much attention to the presidential race.
This August.
Yeah. So you can already kind of see the calendar shaping up, right? So I think that there's room for one, maybe two major deals of some sort. I don't know which ones in particular, but, you know, the idea of cooperating on these little piecemeal bills that the Republican Congress is starting off with, like the Keystone XL pipeline and like redefining the work week under Obamacare. And maybe those could be tacked onto something, a spending bill later, but, you know, we're not going to see like wheeling and dealing on every individual component that the Congress takes up.
The medical device tax, repeal of the medical device tax is not the horse that Republicans can ride into 2016.
No,
I agree.
And it'll blow the hole through the budget. And, you know, it's been interesting to watch.
They've got to choose their battles.
Totally.
Right,
I mean, they'll still pass these things, but then the question is, well, how hard a line are you going to take it? Are you going to say we're not going to pass a spending bill that doesn't include the Keystone Pipeline, things like that? These decisions haven't been made yet, but that's how these little piecemeal things would eventually become laws, by jamming it down the president's throat, because he's made pretty clear this week that he's going to use his veto pen to block stuff he doesn't like.
Burgess Everett is here with us from Politico. We're talking the 114th session of Congress now underway. 866-55-PRESS. Your questions, your comments. Join the conversation. We'll be right back.
This is the Bill Press Show. This is the Bill Press Show.
Why do we eat what we eat? John McQuaid has a new book out called Tasty, which has some of the answers. He'll join us at the half hour. Right now we're talking congressional matters with Burgess Everett from Politico. Burgess, the House did pass one bill this year, or this week, rather. They only passed one last year, but one this week. On terrorism insurance, what's that all about?
Yeah, that's about insuring commercial buildings against terrorist attacks. That lapsed at the end of last year. It was kind of Tom Coburn, who's now retired. It was his last stand. He prevented swift consideration of that bill, so the Harry Reid decided to adjourn the Senate rather than spend 4 to 5 days trying to pass it at the end of the year. So the House passed it on Wednesday, the Senate passed it yesterday, and now it's on to the President's desk, the first law of the new Congress.
What the President says he will sign.
He will sign it, yes.
Yeah. I forget the exact number, but it passed the House the first time with overwhelming number of Democratic and Republican votes, right? I mean, this just says that it came out of 9/11, obviously.
Right. And a separate bill passed the Senate earlier last year overwhelmingly as well. This ended up just being about the fun in covering the Senate every day is one senator can hold everything up, and it gives every individual senator a ton of power, and Tom Coburn was very skilled at exercising that power when he wanted to.
Speaking of one senator, news yesterday that Senator Barbara Boxer, my good friend from California, is not going to seek a fourth term. In the Senate. Does that come as a surprise?
Well, you know, we were talking about this a little in the break, and it's not a surprise for people in California. I was a little surprised at the way she decided to announce it. It's almost this is the kind of new way to announce your retirement, is to figure out how not to let the media scoop you, and that's to put out something yourself, which was a 3-minute video she did with her grandson. So I don't think I was surprised, but she's a very feisty, energetic politician. She doesn't seem to be losing her enthusiasm for the job, so only in the sense that she still seems pretty engaged in the day-to-day matters of Congress was I surprised.
Yeah.
She's not checked out or anything.
No. Yeah, and she's not going to check out for the next 2 years. She's not, and she's not resigning as of now, right? She's just saying she's not going to run for re-election.
But once you do that, you lose your juice a little bit in terms of, people are more concerned with members who are coming back and things like that. So it's interesting she got it off her chest so early at the beginning of the Congress.
She is one of the great fighters for consumers and environmentalists and women and generally working Americans in the United States Senate, and has done a great job, I believe, representing the people of California. Burgess Everett, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
See you again soon.
That's all for AmericasDemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Fred Rotondaro, David Chappell, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For AmericasDemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate.